We have a guest speaker this morning, Catharyn Baird. She began her professional life as a lawyer and practiced law in Denver for a number of years. And you're going to see a progression that we all might think about following. She's also an accomplished author, particularly written Everyday Ethics, Making Wise Choices. She became a professor at Regis, where she taught for 23 years, and she's now a professor emerita at Regis College. But she ended up being a game developer. A great progression, and her game is called the ethics game. And if you took the game and played it, I found out I was a little bit self-righteous. Anyway, it was a great game, and 100 of us took that game, which she's going to talk about this morning. More importantly, there's been 150,000 students take that game and learn about themselves and learn about ethics. It's been tested by over 400,000 people now in the country, and it's used in many universities. Without further ado, Catharyn Baird.
Being with you this morning is truly a privilege. I met Bev some 10 years ago when, as a lawyer, I was an interloper into the Society of Business Ethics in Seattle, Washington at a conference. And Bev commented on the fact that I had sparkles on my fingernails. And I do that to remind myself that life is light, because otherwise I could take myself way too seriously. So we bonded and have become fast friends and have traced each other's careers. And I think part of it is that both of us do have that entrepreneurial spirit where we're doing crazy things that our deans, for whom we thank them, let us do as we begin to move forward. As was said, I began teaching at Regis University some 25 years ago, and as I was tasked with teaching law and ethics in our MBA program, the question I had as someone who is very, very practical is, how do I make this come alive for our students? How do I make them be able to go into our communities and take these ethical theories and live into the very best of the theories, as well as the Jesuit mission, which I have come to love? And so the work that we do today is the sort of the culmination or the next step of that 25-year journey. I took my theme today from you all, integrity in individual and community partnership. One of the reasons I've been so excited to follow your work is that you guys really do talk about the best of conversations among the city people, among government, workers, students, and employers. And that conversation is incredibly critical as we begin to move together to create a community partnership. This morning, the president of Penn State has his first appearance in court. Last week I was at Ohio State University and met with a gentleman whose name is David Friel, who is the chair of the Ethics Committee in Ohio. He talked to a colleague of his who has a corresponding place in Pennsylvania, and the question that I asked is, how did Penn State happen? And the answer that was given was that Penn State systematically took away the structures that were internal to it for accountability. They believed that the reputation of the school, that the reputation of Joe Pa was more important than the structures for excellence. And out of that, people who were watching knew it was just a matter of time before something imploded at Penn State. They just didn't know what it was going to be. And I've chosen the image of the Emperor Has No Clothes for that reason. One of the greatest temptations that we have as we move into business ethics is the ability to say, I don't want to talk about it. To put in place the structures that inhibit people from living into integrity and entering into a conspiracy of silence. So one of the things I'd like to talk with you about today is how we can avoid that conspiracy of silence as we use the tools of the Ethical Lens inventory to speak truth to each other and learn how to listen to each other with different words, different understandings of what that truth means. I include civility because it is critical to our community at this particular time. One of the great sadnesses that I have is that we have become increasingly unable to speak with each other out of different value commitments. And so hopefully one of the things that I would like to do with our work is to increase the ability, not just at the academic level, but in the corporate community, to speak with civility to each other as we work through deeply held values and different images and understandings of what we need to do together to move ourselves forward. And this depends on the moral courage and the shared values that you all have developed in your community. So let's start with a couple of basic definitions. Morality is your personal compass of values and motives. Each of us in this room has a closely held set of those. The ethical lens inventory helped bring to light some of those that are sort of hidden from us. Ethics are actions that count for meeting shared community values. Ethics is all about behaviors. What actions count, what behaviors count for living into these abstract values. As I said, I'm a very practical person, and so if I can't figure out what it is that I'm supposed to do, I don't know how to live into it. I'm also very uppity, as my friends will tell you. And so when I went to work for Regis, having had a sort of a checkered career as an attorney, I represented children at risk, spouses at risk, and thought I was going to be Don Quixote. I asked my dean, what do I need to do to get fired? And he was really very surprised at that question, but in academics the list is very short. You show up, you turn in grades on time, and you don't mess with the kids. And so I thought that that playpen was big enough for me to live in. As I've moved into the corporate world, of course, my playpen is much tinier in terms of what I can do, because the behaviors that are expected of a CEO, as many of you know, are very different than that of a classroom professor. Professional ethics then become our shared and mutually enforced professional norms. At the Academy of Legal Studies and Business last year, we had a speaker, Joe DiMartino, who is an economist. And he has written a book on ethics that faults the economic community for not having professional standards to live into. And so he is on a mission out there for the economists to say, we are professionals and we have a set of values that we live into as professionals. In Omaha, you all are leading that conversation in the business world. Many of the places I go, people don't have an aspirational vision of what it means to be a business professional. And not having that aspirational vision means you live close to the edge. And so I just want to commend you for the work you do together as you look at what does it mean to be a business professional. How do we live then into that value? Now, I like the way Clyde talked about this. I don't know how many of you are friends of Canterville, but we have the conversation. Ethics is what you do when everybody is watching. It's how you act in relationship to how you're supposed to act given your place in society. Morality, on the other hand, is what you do when nobody is watching. And the question, what did you do, Clyde? I'm a moral person, for all you know. The place we begin is self-awareness. What are your core commitments? What behaviors do you have that count for living into those values? And the question that on the ethical lens inventory becomes the most problematic is our shadow side, what keeps us from living into our best self. Again, I have noticed that as one goes farther up the corporate ladder, being in touch with your shadow side is ever more important, because it is the place where we can be tempted into doing unethical acts either out of fear or out of uncertainty. And it's those blind spots that get us every time. The next place is, what are my community core values? The conversations that you all have in Omaha begin to get that matchup between my personal values, my community values, as you learn to share the kinds of behaviors and expectations you have for each other's. And you begin to look and see which are the values are similar, what are different, and how do you begin to negotiate those differences. This is my package for tenure. It's really exciting that you can get tenure on a slide. But as I worked for Regis, the question I asked was, what are the similarities among the ethical theories? What is at a meta-ethical level is coming on? And what I realized is that for all of us, we have two great tensions in our lives. The first is the tension between autonomy and equality, the individual and the community. What are the rights, the prerogatives that the individual should have vis-a-vis the community? And what are the kinds of claims that the community can make on you in terms of shaping your behavior? And so as we think of the joy of having now a day with no political commentary, we realize that much of what we have done over the past 6 months as a nation is engage in that conversation. What should individuals do? What should the community do as we balance our life together? The other great disconnect, if you will, is between the head and the heart. When do you follow the rules? When do you follow mercy? When do you have justice? When do you follow your intuition, your heart? And as I began to work, I realized that all of our ethical dilemmas can be in fact nailed down to these 4 lenses, or these 4 pieces. And this then gave rise to the ethical lens inventory. As I was reading the philosophers more than I ever wanted to read in my entire life, I realized that each of them had a different definition for how you figure out what is ethical. And this was the key to the work that we've done together. If you live in the rights and responsibilities lens, and you have to sort of remember where you were, hopefully, you use your reason to determine what you as an individual think you should do. And this is the hallmark of what we teach in our business schools. It's the hallmark of our economic system. That is, individuals, we use our reason, we think about, and then embrace those duties, embrace those responsibilities that are near and dear to our hearts, as well as our community. The results lens is you make choices that contribute to your happiness. Now, this is the grounding philosophy of the United States. We came of age in a world where what we said is individuals have a right to choose for themselves the paths that they want for happiness. And it's always interesting to me how few people actually land in this ethical lens. I live here. It's wonderful. I annoy people a lot because I live there, because I believe that people should be equipped to make their own choices. My mantra, no victims. You get to choose, life is good, move on. Doesn't sit so well with employees some days, especially the millennials who don't understand this whole thing about choosing how you're going to behave and moving on. Up in the relationship lens, the members of the community choose together the processes to ensure justice for all. I did a seminar with HR people, and every single one of them were in this lens, and I was so surprised. But when I talked to them in the workshop, I realized that they care about how do you get your forms filled, how do we make sure that everybody pays their taxes, how do we make sure that all of the safety things are done, how do we onboard folks. And my COO lives in this lens, and she just gets all over me about process, because of course down the results lens we don't care about process, we want individuals doing their own thing. So the balance then that we have learned is that as you have cross-lens functionality, you are able to bring a depth and a stability to your organization that otherwise you could not. While we began fussing with each other, we now work with each other, and if the processes become overbearing, I tell her to lighten up, and if I forget that there's a process, she tells me that we really do need to follow some things. The community lens, the reputation, the community agrees on the character traits, the habits of thoughtful leadership. And this is where all of us begin to work towards as we think about what does it mean to be a leader. Okay, I know you guys want to know what y'all did. So here's you guys. These are...
Let them know. In the back of your name tags, there's a little piece of paper. If you took the ELI before yesterday, and so it'll remind you of your individual scores.
Okay. Could all look there to see. Yes, Bev is very clear that, and my students are, and when we go out and do things, people take a look and see where you are. You guys were a very interesting mix. We have done a whole lot of work with, as Bev said, we're somewhere north of 150,000 folks who have taken the ethical lens inventory, and they're about 2/3 of them are undergraduates, and 1/3 of them are graduate students, MBA folks. And so we have a real nice mix of professionals that come in this. So the question was, what does it mean? Well, you can see a whole bunch of you are up in the rights and responsibilities lens. Given that you live in Nebraska, I would expect nothing less from you. The Midwest, we are all, as one from Colorado, we love our independence, and we live very carefully in that regard. When we took a look at 70,000 results, we had approximately 40% of the people who had done the ethical lens inventory were in the rights and responsibilities lens. Cross diagonal from it is the reputation lens, and when we took a look at our aggregated results, about 30% of the people live in that lens. So in the United States, 70% of the people are on the rights, responsibilities, reputation lens diagonal. You all actually have a higher percentage of people in the relationship lens than we would see nationally. And that was kind of intriguing to me. The only other scatter plot I've seen like this was faculty members at Robert Morris University in Chicago. And the characteristics, as Bev and I were talking about it, that were similar is that it was a high Roman Catholic population. And so those of you who know, as Father talked today about the fact that the Jesuits care and the Catholic tradition cares about those without power, I like to think of the relationship lens as my favorite Jesuit lens, because the mantra is that you take a look and care for those who are not advantaged. Preferential option for the poor is the magic word that we talk about when we talk about that lens. And so as I am working in institutions that have a strong justice background, we start seeing people up in that quadrant. We also just finished a study of comparing Catholic universities with state institutions. Notre Dame, a colleague at Notre Dame and I wrote the paper together, and we had a whole body of folks. And again, we noticed that from the Catholic institutions, there was a higher percentage of people in the relationship lens and the reputation lens. And then over time, they migrated. So when you started out as a freshman, you were sort of in the middle and confused a bit. And then we noticed that with our Catholic institutions, there was a migration toward the justice lens and the reputation lens, which is part of the grounding of the philosophy of that tradition. So it was very exciting to know that those of you who work in the academic world, our St. Mary's colleagues as well as Creighton folks, that it does make a difference what you teach, and the values that get brought forth in fact inform where we go. So there's where you are. Again, not a whole lot of folks in the results lens, and that would trend with what we see in terms of national averages. So what does it mean? We all landed here. If you read your gifts, you were happy. You found out that those of you in the rights and responsibilities lens knew yourself, you lived out of guiding principles, you were accountable, and most people get real excited about that one. Those of us down the results lens, we value free will, entrepreneurship. We all just want to get along. I hate conflict, I've got to tell you. We want creative change. Nothing stays the same, which of course drives some of my leadership crazy. Relationship lens are the caretakers of our institutions. They're the ones who make sure the least advantaged are cared for. They care about justice, both procedural and substantive, both the way we get to justice and the results at the end. And again, as we take a look at our political climate, the conversation between those who have and those who do not have is one of the ones we really struggle with as we try to figure out how to balance the best of the entrepreneurship, that individual initiative, and making sure that those without power are cared for. And then down the reputation lens, we get moral courage, principled leadership. Now what this means is that this is where you start when you're not thinking. This is where habitually you go. This is where, when the first time you have an ethical situation, this is how you address it. And the work that I like to do is that once you know that, then you balance yourself by asking the questions and the gifts of the other lenses. So this is not a be-all and end-all, but it's a snapshot for where you start. Okay, let's see if we can do a show of hands. How many of you, when you read the gifts, found it was pretty close or spot on to where you think of yourself in terms of your own ethical pieces? We'll see if people see. I love validation. My researchers don't take this, but when we go out, we get about that, which was about 80% of you said, you know, when I looked at that gift, that really does describe who I am. And the question was, how did I do it? And I read people who self-identified into these theories and saw how they described themselves. And that was the way that the research moved forward. Now this is the part that people don't like, blind spots. And I'm not going to talk about vices today, because vices are intentional actions, but our blind spots are the place where unintentionally we can get into trouble. So, rights and responsibilities lens, think of your favorite, absolutely certain bulldozer who knows exactly what we need to do regardless of how we get there. My mother lived in this category. Actually, my daughter, who is a prosecutor for the Internal Revenue Service. I'm not sure how I got her there, but she lives in that lens, and she has as her mission making sure that scofflaws are brought to justice and pay their taxes. It's like, okay, dude. Now, I live down in the results lens, satisfied with too little good. And as I was growing our company from me into, we're up to 18 employees, which for many of you is not a huge amount, but for someone like me is a huge amount. I realized that what I was doing was lowering the bar, and I was letting people not live into their potential because I was too afraid of upsetting them. And so as a CEO, my mission for the past 6 months has been raising the bar and not living into that blind spot of being satisfied with too little good, demanding more of the people who work with me. Relationship lens over confidence and process. If you just follow everything right, we're going to be okay. Now, the way this plays out badly is Texas, where as part of the Innocence Project, they were very nervous because if you, in fact, exonerated people who had been through the process, the belief was that nobody would trust the judicial process. And so they were willing to execute people who were, in fact, innocent in order to protect the integrity of the process. Now, my little results lens found that just abhorrent, but that becomes part of how that process lives. The reputation lens is interesting, and it has to do with unrealistic role expectations. And this means that we take on, as leaders, the responsibility for doing everything, and we think if we're just good enough, if we just do what's required, everything will fall into place. And we forget that people around us have responsibilities too. And being a leader, yes, you're in charge of vision, yes, you're in charge of execution, but you cannot be in charge of everything. Others themselves have responsibilities as well. And so as we begin to be gentle with ourselves in that position, we understand that as leaders, we have capacity, we can make a difference, but we really aren't walking on water quite yet. Well, maybe you guys are. I'm not. Now, what does this translate then to the real world? Well, I have been doing in the past little bit perspectives on truth-telling, because I am so intrigued with the fact that people from the different ethical lenses define telling truth differently. And what happens with this is you're in an organization, everybody's committed to integrity, but they all have a different definition of what truth means, and you wind up then thinking each other is either unethical or not paying attention. Now, my friends who live in the rights responsibilities lens speak the absolute truth as they see it, as asked, and as narrowly as possible. If you don't ask it, you don't get the answer. So when I work with my colleagues, I have 3 in my company who are in this lens, I have to go on an inquisition, where you ask question after question, layer after layer, and they always speak the truth precisely, but only what you ask. So intriguing. Now, me down there, I sort of open my mouth and blurt everything out. I speak the truth so that the person is respected and equipped to make their own decisions. From my lens, the most important thing in the world is that you know the truth so you can choose. Because once you can choose, you're there. Now, the reputation lens is, a relationship lens is very interesting. The insight I had on this week, actually, as I was having a little ethical tiff with my COO, was that people in this lens speak truth in such a way that the power relationships are honored and not abused. To use philosophic language, people in this lens tend to speak truth to power. They have a high suspicion of authority, and many of them see their jobs as making sure that those of us who are at the top of the chain don't abuse our power on those down below. And again, when I began thinking of my favorite HR people, I realized that's exactly what their job is, to make sure that there is justice for everybody in the organization, that salaries are parity, that people are treated fairly. And it's very important in our organizations to have folks who are willing to speak truth to power. Penn State would have survived and done much better had someone done that. And then down in the reputation lens, you speak truth in a way that the community conventions are honored. As I live into my leadership roles, as you live into your roles in the organization, how can we make sure that the power is used appropriately and that they are honored? Does that make some sense to you guys? Can you see how that might play out? Well, the next question then was, how do we get to a story about this? So I pulled out this particular case study that we have, and the case study talks about Kara, a friend, has a friend who's a scientist in the company. She is the VP of HR. She has internal research showing that scientists are paid less, and then the practice would be to maybe get up to $120,000 a year. The practice had been to bring in people the lowest possible salary, and research shows that women tend not to ask their top dollars. Now, in bringing this case study forward, I did it because last week when I was at Miami University, I forgot to mention I managed to spend the entire last week before the election in Ohio. It was really kind of intriguing. But I was at Miami University, and we had 4 professionals who were around the table talking, and we happened to bring up this case study, which their students at the graduate level really struggle with. And I had 4 fully functioning adults who before had been very civil at each other as they were just going at, well, what would you do and why? Now, had I been smart, I would have listened to my CTO, who's a Nebraska native, who says, Catharyn, this is the most boring case study in the world. Everybody knows that anybody who is not paid equally is just because they haven't done what they need to do, that there's people in the pipeline. If you do what you're supposed to do, you're going to get paid. Now, what I realized, of course, is he lives in the rights and responsibilities lens. He lives in a place where we're going to get the data, we're going to figure out what the data shows us, and the data will show us that there are multiple reasons for salary parity not happening. It doesn't really matter. Go get a life. Rex thought me bringing this to you guys today was kind of fun. Now, down there, though, in my lens, the question becomes, if Kara asked me the question, I would say, sure, research and mine match. And I want to tell you this answer is not happy with lawyers who work for companies, HR people, because the transparency that for me is absolutely critical for them puts the company at risk. And so that was what the fuss was about, is as you're working with issues of confidentiality, as you're working with issues of conflict of interest, at what point do you have absolute unvarnished transparency versus something that's more measured, more careful to make sure that the interests of the company do not become compromised as you are working towards justice. And so we go up to the relationship lens, where what you do is you focus on what the position says. Because of my position, I can't comment. Now, this comment that came was from let's see if I get this right, a faculty member who is an employment law attorney. And she said, what I would advise you to do if you were my client would be to say, I really can't comment, but you know you have options. Now, I went into apoplexy because that sounds like an invitation to a lawsuit. But she was very clear that the process needs to be transparent so people know what their options are. And then my sales dude, as I refer to him, lives in the reputation lens, and he says, what's really cool, my role takes priority over my friendship, and so in my role, I would then say, I can listen to you, but I may not be able to help. Now, as you listen to this, I don't know what your responses are, but what it brings to us in the business community is that as we are seeking integrity, truth-telling, transparency, we have different definitions of what it means and different approaches. And this is why the conversation at the community level, the conversation at an organization level is so important to have shared ethical norms that guide the behavior. Okay, I've just got one more very quickly, then I know I need to open it up for questions. So how would you communicate this? So if you're in the mid-level, and I know many of you guys are at the top, I had never realized that people managed up to me, that they very carefully would couch what they said to make sure that I didn't kill the messenger as they were sharing with me what was going on. And so the rights and responsibilities person would go and get more data, then go to the CEO and say, what can we do? The results lens person might go check the dimensions of the data for every place else, and then figure out strategies to get us into parity. The relationship lens would go out and do a salary survey. We're going to go out and see what everybody's doing. We're going to bring that data into you. We're going to move it. I didn't even know the kind of salary surveys that were out there. And the reputation lens I loved, which is I go right to the leadership team and get something in place to get the ship righted, but it's going to take 3 to 5 years, nothing fast. We have to work on this gradually. So where do we all get to? The takeaway I would like to have you is that there is a checklist for action. As we begin to use the ethical lens inventory and its tools, there are more than one ways to approach ethical decision making. And as we use the tools of all 4 of the lenses, we are able to make better decisions and avoid the pitfalls. When I worked through an ethical dilemma in my company, I'd literally go through all 4 of these. Am I treating people as fully functioning adults? What is it that my goals are that I'm trying to accomplish? Am I really doing it in a way that makes people happy? Happy in the big sense, happy in that they are growing into their profession, they are contributing to the community, they are feeling like they have meaning and value in their life. Am I in fact assuring that we don't have any victims? You take responsibility for your choices. Do I have everybody at the table? Do all my processes have a purpose? And then am I seeking excellence in all that I do? And so as we begin to do this together, my hope, my belief is that the tool of the Ethical Lens Inventory and the work that you're doing with the Business Ethics Alliance can help you sharpen your focus, increase the quality of the conversations, so together you can have a sense of what are those shared behaviors, those shared values that will move Omaha into excellence. So, thank you very much. And then we have
time for question and answers. We have about 5 minutes. Any questions?
Yeah.
My question would be, ideally, wouldn't you want to be right in the middle?
Oh, well, great question.
This broad overview of all the lenses.
This is one where if I could figure out how to do the research, I'm just not that smart, we would do this. We have 3 different situations where people end up in the middle. We see this with freshmen and sophomores with a huge number in the middle, and my belief on that is that they really haven't differentiated themselves from the values of their parents. So one of the core tasks of a freshman-sophomore experience is to come up with your own notions, to affirm your parents where you want to, move on where you don't. So center happens there. We also see center happening when people are changing career fields. And so they are in transition. And then we have people like you where perhaps in the center you are able to see all the sides of a picture and then move into the different lenses. So were you in the center?
No, but close.
Close, okay. So which, if I can put you on the spot, so do you see yourself as being able to use the tools of all the lenses as you're sort of moving in that middle space?
You always wish it would be easier.
One does wish it would be easier, yes. And when I go out and we talk to people who are in the middle, they said, I would like to think that I am one who can use all the tools, and I do know that sometimes I get whipsawed because I can see so much of both sides that I really cannot make a decision clearly. So I think that the center has some real strength because it can see all, but you do have to worry or be attentive to the fact that you can become paralyzed and not act forcefully. Other questions? Yes.
Catharyn, you see this maybe in a global context? Would you expect that cultural differences would push people into one quadrant more than others?
Our early expectation is yes, we are going to do our first major study with Thunderbird University. We're going to have about 400 international students taking it. We just finished a study that had 45 to 50, I don't remember the exact end, Chinese. And what we found was a huge number of them below the line, very few above the line. And so they were very much more in the sensibility lenses. And they were significantly absent in the rights and responsibilities lens. And so where your guys, if you can imagine the way you all went, where you were on the top 2 on the side, the Chinese were on the bottom 2 moving up into the top. And so what we are expecting to see is that there are cultural differences. In that study, we did not get to ask them what their religious beliefs were, what their family of origin were. That with the study with Thunderbird we will. And they're all graduate students, which means they've been in the workplace as opposed to undergrads, so they're people who have come to some understanding of who they are. The piece that for me as a researcher is wonderful is that the values hold internationally. It has to do with which values take priority in given communities. And so the values themselves are universal. What is not universal is the behaviors that count for living into the values and which values come to the top. Yes?
Catharyn, I'm thinking about implementation inside a company. And the question is, can you use this tool in hiring and selection, and what exposure do you have legally if you do so?
I love that question. So the piece that this tool should never ever be used for is a predictor of whether somebody is going to be ethical. What it can be used for is a conversation about what your values are and seeing how well you live into those values. And so in that regard, what we find it useful for in companies, we've done a handful of corporate trainings, is with team building, where people really get a sense of the differences between them and their colleagues. And then in leadership training, as people learn how to work with people from different ethical lenses. At a leadership level, I believe that what is useful is if you listen to the words that those around you are using and then mirror back their ethical language, that you are able then to validate their values and help them live into their own values. My sister, who is my COO, which maybe is part of why we fuss about this, really has as her vision using it as the hiring and part of the onboarding. And so what she would see is that you would hire somebody, but during that first 60, 90 days when they're just getting their feet under them, that the ethical lens inventory and perhaps some of the tools can be used to instantiate the values of the organization as people then begin to talk about their values in context of others. And so if you do it that way, you won't have any legal exposure.
There's one more
She
hand
says.
back here.
Yes.
Catheryn, just a little bit different spin. I know we're talking about business and ethics. We've just gone through quite an intense campaign cycle,
Yes.
an election cycle. The intensity of the negative campaigning, and I approve this message. Where do negative campaigning and politics and ethics come together? Any comment?
It's a really interesting piece because if we think about it at the most positive, we have had a vigorous conversation about completely different visions for where we need to go as people. And we're seeing a real crossroads in terms of the values of the radical individuals versus the community, and I think that that's been playing out. The sad part is that as human beings, we love the smarmy side. And so the data shows that we tend to focus on our blind spots, the vices, and the negative, and that we as human beings, because we live in that space, tend to respond to the negative messages. Now, the research also tells us that if we start focusing on the positive, that there can be some shifts in it. But I think our political campaign shows us human nature at its worst, as people are working for power, and yet has some glimmers of hope, she says, ever hopeful for the way the conversation may unfold.
So does that mean as people we're not ethical?
As people, we are not ethical. One of the things that happens is there's something called the defining interest test, which begins to take a look at how ethical we are. And we have, the data would indicate that 80% of us think we're operating at high ethical maturity, and in fact, probably about 70% of us are operating at mid to low ethical maturity. And ethical maturity has to do with living into your own principles in community, where as an individual and community work together. But moving into that level of responsibility is really difficult. Many of our organizations do not support that, and in fact, we support cutting corners and some other kinds of things. And people are smart. They know where their bread is buttered, and so they will go with that. And so those of us who care about ethics actually are like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. We keep hoping it's going to make it, and then human nature takes in, and we roll back down, and then we try it again. I don't know. Are you more hopeful about human nature than I am? I used to be more Okay, so thank you all very much. It's been an absolute privilege.